Around this time, you actively protested the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War as well,
Yes.
and protested the war funding for the war on poverty.
I'm sorry, protested?
Protested the declining funding.
Oh, well, what we were concerned with is that there was a connection between the two. But as far as the Vietnamese War, I frankly just didn't understand it. And I went to meetings and I tried to talk with people, including people in the Pentagon and in the White House. You have to remember that Lyndon Johnson was the president then. Brookings had a very close relationship with Lyndon Johnson. And indeed, we had our 50th anniversary, and he was the keynote speaker at the 50th anniversary. So allegedly, I was able to talk with insiders, and I couldn't get a coherent picture of why we were in Vietnam, why we were involved in deaths, destruction, the maiming, and I came out very strongly against the war when I saw this picture of a child running down the street, a Vietnamese child who had been napalmed. You know, of course, collateral damage. No one tried to napalm her, but when I saw that, by that time I think I had 2 children, and it just made me sick. And so I figured I'm going to work against this. And I had a colleague at Brookings, Martin Carnoy, and Martin and I worked together with 4 or 5 other people to form a group called Concerned Citizens for Peace. And what did that consist of? Well, we were a little naive, but we went from house to house on Saturdays with a map of Washington to take over, try to get people to take over precincts so we could get Johnson out of there. And what we did is we did interviews with people, short interviews, and then we did punch cards at Brookings. They didn't know this, in the Brookings Computer Center, with their views, their attitudes, whether they were willing to attend meetings. We had churches in Washington who were willing to host meetings because a lot of the church people were against the war. And then we had I.F. Stone. I don't know whether you're familiar with him, but he was a journalist who wrote against the war and a lot of other of the bad policies. He was very well known at this time. And basically it was try to organize things to take over the Democratic precincts, to get basically nomination representatives, I've forgotten what they're called, to find an alternative to Johnson. And basically our alternative was Robert Kennedy, who had also created great skepticism on the war. And so we were involved in that. I also took a long-term substitute position in the Washington, D.C. public schools because I realized I didn't know enough of practice. Again, I tend to be fairly hands-on in terms of connecting the way I understand things. And so I got a job in a junior high school in Washington, D.C., Benjamin Banneker Junior High School, 14th Street Northwest. It was all black, even though this was now 1967, and the Supreme Court had come out with its decision saying separate is not equal in 54 and 55. The Washington, D.C. schools were still segregated. And so I taught social studies in this school, and I think I learned a lot about the daily life of teachers and students. Long-term substitute meant that they couldn't decide where you were going to teach or move you around. They could make you an offer, and if you could accept it or reject it. Washington, D.C. had so many openings that they couldn't fill, that there was this category of long-term substitutes, people who would teach as long as they wanted in any particular school. And so I chose this school. I had a friend who also taught in this school. That's the reason I was in touch, and he told me, oh, there's an opening in social studies. And so I worked in the school basically till 3, and then I would go to Brookings and work for another few hours, and I would turn the school check over to Brookings because Brookings was paying me more, and they accepted that I could do this. So I did this for most of a year.
You really just wanted the experience of doing that then.
Yeah, I wanted the experience, and it was for most of a year. I learned so much. A lot of it not very elating, but that's life.
You consider that a life-changing experience, right?
Well, a lot of it, some of it I'd suspected. You know, it's always hard to say, gee, it was one of those things that just suddenly changed. But when you then combine that with what you know from other people who have been in education for a long time, I met people like Larry Cuban. Larry Cuban was in the Washington, D.C. schools at the time. I met a lot of people at Brookings. That part was really successful. I didn't meet Larry at Brookings, but I met Larry in the Washington, D.C. schools. Larry eventually became a student of mine, and then he became a colleague of mine. So it's interesting how these paths go. Back to Martin Carnoy, Martin and I became very close friends. This was 1966, so you can imagine how long we've been colleagues and friends. But the people at Brookings objected to the stuff we were doing. We were also, broadly, I didn't do this, writing editorials for the Washington Post, for The Nation, and for the New Republic, saying that we had talked about a peace dividend, and all that peace dividend in terms of the public budget is being eaten up by this war, and this is squeezing the war on poverty, which is the war that we really favored. Mm-hmm. And we started to get subtle pressures in Brookings. I mean, there's academic freedom, but subtle pressure. We were the lowest level in the research staff. Mm-hmm. This wasn't going to be a very welcoming place for people like us in the long run. And the job market was phenomenal at that time.
Sure.
So I started to get letters based largely on the article that Sam Bowles and I had published at this point, or at least had gotten around in a clandestine way at this point. And but people heard about me and this new field, economics of education. It was a relatively new field. So I started to get calls from schools of education. And one of them was Stanford. I had never been west of Indiana, I think. And so I figured, well, you know, if they're going to invite me out to give a talk, I'll see the Bay Area. And to make that as short as possible, that led to their making an offer, which I accepted, with an appointment in education, but also in economics, to teach in economics. And I hadn't ever taught in a school of education or gotten enough background in the school of education. So that kind of cemented it, because I would still have a relationship with the field that I knew better. So I accepted that, and that was probably a good decision, because that was late fall of 1967, and then in 1968, you know what happened to Robert Kennedy in the spring of 1968. He was assassinated. So, I mean, our hopes just got destroyed. The peace movement, all of this. So getting a new start was important. And I also thought, since I now had 2 kids and the marriage really wasn't working at all, it was important to get a new start. And so within 6 months, I found another opening at Stanford. I told them Martin Carnoy is the only person in the country who could possibly fill that opening. And within 6 months, Martin joined me.
You brought him out. You were the first professor of education economics at Stanford.
Yeah, and
he was the second.
And he joined me, yeah.
Yep. After you made the move to Stanford, your daughter, Mia, fondly remembers sitting on your shoulders at the forefront of a massive peace march in 1969. That's one of her fondest memories. She also remembers you playing the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Santana, Donovan, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and the Brazilian jazz album Black Orpheus, nonstop and loud when she was little. You love your music.
Yeah, I do.
She also recalls you teaching her how to write limericks, and that the itchiness that she felt under her thick winter coat was caused by vicissitudes.
Yeah.
She and your other children note you always have been quite the comedian.
Well, I mean, they consider it very corny comedy, you know. So when they say comedian, I think they're speaking tongue in cheek. They're saying, "Oh God, not another one of those."
You also served on the Palo Alto School Board.
I did. Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, Palo Alto was going to do something which was a big mistake. This was in the middle 80s. When we arrived in Palo Alto, there were 22 elementary schools. There were 3 high schools and 3 junior high schools. Probably about 9,000 students, 10,000 maybe. And over time, families changed. Kids grew up, and so the school population went down pretty dramatically. And at that time, there were about 7,200, 7,300 students, and they had gone from 22 elementary schools to 11. So there was this mentality of how do we continue to downsize, what I call sharing the shortage among the peasants mentality. And if you think that way, you don't think of possibilities. Well, I went out and I looked at the demography, and what was happening then was these yuppie families were moving into Palo Alto, professional families buying the homes of that previous generation, and then in their 30s having children. That wasn't recognized in Palo Alto. And when I looked at just newborns in the Stanford Hospital, just a number of sources, we were going to be expanding our population, and they were trying to figure out how to get down to just, they had already closed two of the 3 what were junior high schools and then middle schools, so we had just 1 middle school still open, and they wanted to merge the 2 high schools into a supersized high school, to a high school with about 2,400 students, instead of having 2 high schools that at that time had about 1,200. And the argument was, oh, it's going to be great for the town. We'll have a catalog that will be like a college catalog with all the courses we can offer with 2,400 or 2,500 students as opposed to 1,200. And it was just bad thinking. I would ask, okay, you have 2 swim teams that compete against each other between the 2 high schools. Half of those kids aren't going to be eligible to swim. Which half? Think about it, you know. And I also, by that time, was very persuaded by Ted Sizer, less is more. Let's really do such beautiful stuff in terms of writing and English and things like that, that we won't need to have 1 course for science fiction for those kids who just want science fiction, 1 course for romantic writing, or which was the idea, to get loads and loads of different courses in a college catalog kind of thing. Let's just do beautiful stuff across genres, and so that all kids are excited and are exposed to different genres, but a smaller number of courses, and then let's look for the teachers who can really turn on the kids. And see, this corresponded with my work on accelerated schools, which I had started around 1980, which is emphasizes enrichment, treating all kids as gifted. And so anyway, I ran for the school board on the basis that let's not close more schools. We can find ways to finance them. The population is definitely going to be increasing in the schools. We need to move in the opposite direction. And it was a very optimistic, positive message. And people were shocked by it because their view was always, how do we save our school system? You know, we're inevitably going to be downsizing. I said, no. Well, it turns out now Palo Alto, which is all kind of, has been developed for, I don't know, a century, is now up at 9,000, 9,600. They're looking for space. They closed too many elementary schools. It's exactly what happened. It takes time, and demography change, demographic change takes time, but that's exactly what happened. So I was elected to the school board. I had the largest number of yes votes of any candidate, not only for that election, but as far as they could tell, ever. And all that it had to do with it had little to do with the fact that I was at Stanford, because they had always had at least 1 Stanford professor on the school board. But it had to do with a much more optimistic message, that most of it would be realized over time. Fortunately, you know, it's not good if you have a message and it's nonsense.
Sure.
So anyway, I was on the school board and learned a lot. another thing that's interesting is people came to me and said, oh, this is just like playing with blocks. You've been in education so long and done so much work in education. I said, no, I'm just learning a lot about, again, that hands-on stuff. What happens at the street level, you know? I did. I felt as naked and naive on a lot of things as anyone coming on the school board, because there's a difference between knowing something about the field of education and, you know, and getting involved in practical decisions in your community.
Sure.